You are listening to the SecureWorld Sessions, the cybersecurity podcast that gives you access. Access to people and ideas that inspire and inform. Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the SecureWorld Sessions. It's Bruce Sussman here, your podcast host. And you may know if you're a regular listener, I'm Director of Content at SecureWorld. And in today's session, we are going to be uncovering the cybersecurity wake-up call that is flowing straight out of the coronavirus pandemic.
The bottom line is that the United States on cybersecurity, and now we're experiencing something similar, has experienced a number of wake-up calls over the last sort of decade and a half. In 2014, China hacked OPM. We didn't really improve the state of our government cybersecurity. In 2015 and 2016, we saw as Russia turned off the power grid in Ukraine, and we haven't really taken massive steps to improve the security of our power grid. We saw NotPetya and WannaCry in 2017 and 2018. We haven't really done much to lock down our critical systems. And now we're experiencing the pandemic, which is a massive disruption. These have all been opportunities for us to really sort of wake up and smell the roses. And we continually sort of hit the snooze button.
Will we wake up this time? Our featured interview today is the Director of Research and Analysis at the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Also today, fresh insights from Trend Micro. We're talking about Maze ransomware, and you've been seeing the headlines on that, I'm sure, and how to defend against that type of ransomware. Trend Micro, by the way, is our premier podcast partner. Now, to today's featured topic. We know the United States is a defense superpower in the air, across the oceans, and on land. But according to the new U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, we are well short of where we should be when it comes to defending our nation in cyberspace. And according to a new white paper by the Commission, the COVID-19 pandemic reveals new cybersecurity priorities that need to be tackled. Let's dive into our interview now with Rob Morgus, lead author of the new white paper and Director of Research and Analysis at the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So Rob, first of all, thank you for joining us today on the SecureWorld Sessions podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bruce. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, great to have you here. And I have to admit that I read your white paper about the parallels between the pandemic and the cyber threat landscape as I was returning from vacation, from the first vacation when we were finally, let out of our homes after months, right? So that felt good. But I was really intrigued by not only the parallels, but the new recommendations that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission has made. And I want to dive into that. But first, can you kind of help our audience understand who exactly or what exactly is this commission and what's your end game? I think there's some confusion about that, even within cybersecurity circles.
Yeah, so in late 2018, Congress, recognizing that the U.S. kind of lacks a coherent and cohesive cybersecurity strategy, national cybersecurity strategy, national cyber deterrence strategy, as Congress put it, authorized the creation of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission through the 2019 fiscal year National Defense Authorization Act. The commission is a congressional commission, so we are governmental, but we have 14 commissioners, including 4 sitting congressmen. That's Congressman Langevin, Congressman Gallagher, who's one of the co-chairs, Senator Angus King, who is the other co-chair, and Senator Ben Sasse, along with representation from the executive branch. So we have a commissioner from DHS, from FBI, from the Department of Defense, and from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And then we have several civilian or non-governmental commissioners, folks who have government experience, who have industry experience. Tom Fanning, the CEO of Southern Company, sits as one of our commissioners. Suzanne Spalding, who ran NPPD, which is, of course, the precursor to CISA, for a period of time, Frank Salufo, Chris Inglis, the former deputy director of the National Security Agency. So we have a group of folks, a bipartisan/nonpartisan group of commissioners that came together and provided their expertise, and a staff of about 25 to 30 folks, depending on what time of year and whether we were in surge capacity. We spent the better part of 2019, so sort of from May until December, researching the issues and putting together our initial report, which launched in March. And in sort of the early part of this year, we've been working with folks on the Hill to implement legislative proposals for the recommendations to make sure that they actually gain traction and will go somewhere. And then, as you noted, Bruce, just recently, in fact, I think at the beginning of June, we released our first white paper, which was a white paper that looks at the parallels and the lessons that we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic that apply to cybersecurity and resiliency writ large.
Okay, great. So appreciate that overview. And as I was listening to you list off some of the leaders, I could tell it's Democrats and Republicans, so it's bipartisan. I know that's an important thing to point out in this day and age, right? So everybody on board with trying to defend us in cyberspace, basically, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I've been in DC for the better part of a decade now, and in my time here, we've seen sort of the uptick in partisanship, but to be frank with you, I thought this group that came together was sort of exemplified what nonpartisanship or bipartisanship should look like. You would sit around the table at our commission meetings and you wouldn't be able to tell who sort of is coming from what background based on the conversation. It was really collaborative. There was a good sort of collegial atmosphere, even with the folks in Congress and with the executive branch folks sitting at the table. So it was a fantastic experience from that perspective.
Yeah, that's really great. Okay, fantastic. Well, let's dive into the main purpose of our interview, which was this white paper that you were the lead author of. Really fascinating about some of the parallels between the cyber threat landscape, cybersecurity, and the COVID-19, or really any pandemic for that matter. What kind of parallels did you find?
Yeah, so we found a large number of parallels. And I would just start by saying the COVID-19 pandemic has challenged our resilience on a national scale and illustrates the challenges with building and maintaining resilience in a modern connected world in a way that I think few disruptions that we've seen in the last sort of 2 decades really have. The lessons the country is learning from the ongoing pandemic and the associated response, they're not perfectly analogous to a significant cyber attack, which was the mandate of the commission was to figure out how we withstand and prevent significant cyber attacks. But they do offer many illuminating parallels. And I would say a few things about those parallels at a high level. First, both a pandemic and a significant cyber attack are global in nature. They don't really respect state borders. They require international partnership and collaboration, both in terms of sort of understanding what's going on and figuring out the best way to remedy or treat. Second, both require, from a national perspective, a whole of nation response. And we're really learning that from the pandemic. But if we were to experience a significant cyber attack, I think the most likely target would be somewhere in industry. The economy is sort of our backbone of our national strength. It's likely to be targeted. And a response to a significant cyber attack that affects our economy would require not just the government, not just industry, but both working together to really figure out, what's the role of industry in maintaining operations, in securing our own infrastructure. But then government is uniquely placed to actually go and respond to threats out there in the open, right? We don't allow our companies, we don't allow our companies to hack back. Our companies don't have militaries that can go and actually take physical action. They don't have law enforcement, right? That's uniquely government purview. So there needs to be real collaboration there. Third, testing and treatments for both can emerge slowly, placing a premium on building systems that are agile, resilient, and enable coordination across the government and the private sector, to that last point. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, and I think we really are learning this when we look at the stimulus bills that are coming out of Congress, prevention is going to be far, far cheaper than sort of post hoc or after the event responses, and pre-established relationships are far more effective than relationships that we have to build on the fly. So when we looked at sort of the relationship between the pandemic and what we'd expect to see from a significant cyber attack, we really drew out those parallels. And then from there, we were able to begin to conduct some of our analysis.
Yeah, interesting. And I could see what you're saying. I mean, it's like what is that? An ounce of prevention is cheaper than a pound of cure, and we've certainly seen that, in the cyber realm. I mean, our audience knows that, and obviously, you guys are taking that approach. So that's great. Thank you for discussing the parallels. What about the new priorities or recommendations that the commission has made now as a result of what we are going through or have just been through? There are 4 new recommendations that came from the commission around cybersecurity, and I'll just throw one of them out there, and maybe you can unpack it just a little bit. The first one that I noticed was passing an Internet of Things security law. Can you tell us a little bit about why this suddenly became, from your viewpoint, a new recommendation that the commission needed to make?
Sure. Yeah. So the white paper itself, it highlights about 30 to 35 of the commission's initial recommendations, and then 2 of those get modified, which we can talk about here in a little bit, and then there are 4 new ones to your point. One of those is that IoT security law recommendation. And basically what the commission observed is we are now highly reliant on folks being able to work from home, right? When we have to socially distance and we're a little bit less mobile, we're not allowed to gather in groups larger than 10. Generally speaking, folks who can have been pushed to work from home. This challenges traditional enterprise IT security in a lot of ways, right? You have people relying on personal devices in their home. You have people relying on personal routers, which are now a core part of the enterprise IT environment. And we know that routers, especially personal routers, are a particularly vulnerable point in the ecosystem. We had a series of recommendations that looked at how we can incentivize better security from routers in our initial report. But many of the commissioners, in fact, thought that this required sort of an extra sort of double down and extra attention given the newfound importance of routers and their security. So we started by looking at sort of what we can do there. And there are a few precedents out there with the UK. California also has an IoT security law. And we looked hard at those and said, okay, well, what would something like this look like on the national scale in the United States? What are some of the IoT devices that we know are most vulnerable and are amongst the largest problems when we talk about potential vulnerability and attack surface? And routers are the obvious ones. So we honed in on routers for the IoT law. But at the end of the day, we left it open to be a little bit broader than that, because we do know that if you want to talk about industrial settings, for example, there's a lot of insecure devices in industrial settings. The key for us with this recommendation, though, well, we wanted to keep it broad in terms of the types of products and services that it could cover. We wanted to be relatively narrow and not super prescriptive when it came to the actual solutions or standards that are prescribed by the law, right? So there are a certain number of really low-level good practices that we want to encourage through something like this. One is unique authentication by default, right? So a unique username and a unique password for every device that goes out there. Another sort of building on that idea that we wanted to throw out there into the conversation is the notion that when you connect an IoT device, and IoT is sort of a squishy definition, it can include pretty much anything and everything. We put routers under there, but you can also put your smart thermostat under there, or your Fitbit under there, right? When you connect it to a network for the first time, what we're suggesting is that the user should have to create a new password and username, right? So that encourages more unique authentication. And then the second big piece of this, it revolves around patchability. In a lot of cases, IoT providers and vendors and manufacturers are incentivized, and this is the dynamics of the market, to prioritize getting a product to market over getting a product to market securely. And in many cases, these products are not set up in a way that they are able to receive patches, whether remotely or in person. And we think it's a relatively low ask, and it's some low-hanging fruit to sort of make the demand or the ask that these devices do actually have capability to be patched. We're not saying you have to patch them. We're saying you need to have the capability to patch them.
Yeah, that's great. And I will tell you that last point certainly has been a topic of discussion at our conferences, for years now, right? Talking about building security into the IoT instead of trying to bolt it on or, force the consumer to bolt it on, which we know that's really not realistic in most cases. So that's really a great, thank you for unpacking that point. So beyond that, another one of the of the new recommendations that really caught my eye, was support nonprofits that assist law enforcement cybercrime and victim support efforts. So what did you have in mind on this one?
Yeah, so we recognize, and as we were developing this paper, the current situation around the protests around the country and around the globe weren't actually unfolding, but we recognize as we're launching it that it's kind of a difficult time to be talking about law enforcement. With that said, we have seen, and the FBI and other law enforcement agencies have been kind enough to share some statistics with us, but we've seen basically a drastic uptick in cybercrime activities that are taking advantage of the circumstances of the pandemic, whether it's fraud around the COVID stimulus checks that went out to people, or sinkholing via websites that are offering advice or the like. We've seen an uptick. And when we looked at that, we said, okay, so what are some things that we can do to help alleviate some of the stress that law enforcement is feeling right now on the cybercrime front? We had a recommendation in the initial report to strengthen the NCIJTF, which is the National Crime Task Force that has most of the major law enforcement agencies as a part of it, the Cybercrime Task Force. But we thought, well, one of the things that's lacking right now, and the FBI was candid with us and said, we rely heavily on this series of nonprofits that have a hard time getting funding, especially for not just victim notification, but victim support after the fact. And they floated the idea of a grants program to ensure that these law enforcement nonprofits have robust capability and capacity in order to continue to do that support. The commissioners took that on board, thought it was a very good idea, and the idea snowballed from there. So what we're envisioning is a grants program run out of the Department of Justice that would go to supporting mostly existing nonprofits that focus primarily on victim support to cybercrime.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, appreciate that, and interesting that the FBI was so candid with you too. That's really cool. Your third one is also fascinating to me. The third new recommendation around cybersecurity, and it's establish the Social Media Data and Threat Analysis Center. Unpack this a little bit, if you would.
Yeah. So we have two disinformation related recommendations in the pandemic white paper. That's one of them. And I can talk about that here in a second. And the second one is similar actually to the law enforcement one. And it's basically grants to nonprofits that work on identifying and communicating, importantly, disinformation campaigns to the public. The contention of myself and pretty much all of the commissioners is that we live in a democracy. We don't want the government to be the arbiter of truth, and we want all democratic governments to sort of keep at arm's length the inclination to become the arbiter of truth. But what we do need is robust capacity to identify disinformation, especially malign foreign influence campaigns, and communicate that both to the platforms that are being used and leveraged in order to conduct those campaigns and the general public to help put them in context and help the general public understand what they're looking at when it comes to misinformation or disinformation. The DTAC, as it's called, which is the center, is actually an idea from the previous National Defense Authorization Act, and it's in that bill, and it's essentially calling on the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to fund a nonprofit center, a non-governmental nonprofit center that will work with social media and the intelligence community to help share information across those two in an effort to identify disinformation campaigns and malign foreign influence campaigns as they happen. It's a really challenging topic, especially in this day and age when everything that can be politicized seems to get politicized, right? So I think, the challenge in implementing this, and it's not implemented just yet, and that's why we recommended, actually do what you're being told to do in the NDAA. But the challenge is going to be putting those safeguards in place to ensure that this cannot be abused by whomever is in power in government at a given time to censor legitimate freedom of speech. But that's part of the reason why the commission wanted to double down on sort of disinformation recommendations. And that's why we said civil society is incredibly important here. If governments are not going to be the ones, stating that this is true and this is false, and we don't want them to be, we do need somebody who can help us identify when there's a false narrative that's being peddled out there by a foreign intelligence agency, for example. There are a number of nonprofit centers out there that do this work right now. I'm thinking of things like the Alliance for Securing Democracy, the Digital Forensics forensics research laboratory at the Atlantic Council that do a really good job of really diving into and dissecting and communicating when ongoing influence campaigns and disinformation campaigns are hitting the American airwaves, so to speak. And we felt that those are a crucial part of our disinformation, sort of countering our disinformation ecosystem, and they need to be supported as such.
So those are the new cybersecurity recommendations from the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, all as a result of what we've been going through during the pandemic. But the Commission also says some of its original recommendations need to pivot, and others have become much more urgent. That part of our discussion with Rob Morgus is coming up. Trend Micro is sharing some best practices now to defend against a Maze ransomware attack. And as you've been reading about it or hearing about it, yes, it is the type of ransomware that encrypts your organization's data, but it also removes that data beforehand, and the ransomware operators then threaten to publish it for the world to see unless you pay the ransom, the extortion demand. So here are some tips on how to avoid this ransomware. They're today's Trend Micro Top 3. Number 1, audit your email security solutions. Have you ensured that they have enabled advanced detection of socially engineered emails, the type of emails that ransomware actors often utilize? Number 2, patch or virtually patch your devices to prevent the use of an exploit or exploit kit used by many ransomware actors. And maybe you've seen the recent CISA alerts on this type of topic, known exploits, unpatched, being used by attackers. So definitely check your cyber hygiene. And number 3, upgrade your security solutions at your endpoints and enable machine learning, behavior monitoring, and other advanced detection capabilities. Now, for more specifics on Maze ransomware exploits and some of these mitigation techniques, check out the show notes for the link to these new insights from Trend Micro. Now, back to our interview with Rob Morgus, Director of Research and Analysis at the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. The pandemic reveals that some of the Commission's original recommendations need what you might call a rapid refresh.
That's right. Although I would say there are 2 modified recommendations.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Probably worth touching on, and then we can sort of get into the rest of the report. The first, and this is frankly for me one of the most exciting, even though it doesn't sound that exciting, is we looked, and this is one of those that falls into the category of cybersecurity challenges that were sort of unearthed by the COVID pandemic rather than sort of lessons about resiliency from the COVID pandemic. We looked at the digitization of critical services, and many of these critical services are run out of state and local, tribal, or territorial governments. Many of them have relatively small IT budgets. They have small IT security budgets, and they've had a hard time digitizing some of their critical services. So in our initial report, we had a recommendation that talked about expanding the uptake of secure cloud services, which is one avenue into digitization of the workplace and of services writ large. The Commission took a hard look at that and suggested that we need to modify the recommendation to essentially call on Congress to include grants to SLTT governments as part of potential future stimulus packages around COVID to incentivize the uptake of cloud services for one, but also to expand that a little bit to talk about digitization and IT modernization in these governments writ large. And the way we view this happening is essentially through 2 grants. The first would come sort of immediately, and it would be a block grant to states based on population. And we imagine them pointing that at sort of digitizing their business practice, right? So digitizing their payroll, digitizing their sort of consumer facing portals, their relationship management, buying cybersecurity tools and services. The second would be a tranche of grants that would run for sort of 2 to 5 years, and it would be made available to not just states, but local, tribal, territorial governments. And these grants would be given on a competitive basis where these states would come to us with an idea for how to digitize some of the services they provide, whether it's emergency services or government benefit and entitlement programs or unemployment, right, which we're seeing an obvious uptick in the need for a lot of those services, yet people can't go to their local offices or are discouraged from going to their local offices in an effort to sort of flatten the curve. So they would come to DHS and with the DHS and FEMA and basically say, we have an idea for a project. Here's what we want to do. We need this amount of money. And one of the keys for both of these grants is the sort of state CIOs and municipalities are not all equally empowered. And one of the things that we're trying to do through this grant is further empower CIOs as the primary lead for these grant projects. And then the second thing, to ensure that they actually have the funds to maintain them, we are asking for a requirement for at least a 10% of the funds to go into a working capital fund to ensure maintenance over time.
Cool. That's really cool. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And I think the CIOs will definitely, they'll like that piece of it.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great. That's great. Okay. And one of the other things, and we don't, really have time to unpack all of these, but I know that in your paper, you specifically called out a number of the recommendations that were made in the March 2020 Solarium Commission report. You called out some of those things as being made more urgent as a result of what we understand now, having gone through COVID-19. Can you just hit on a few of those briefly?
Yeah, so we bucketed our analysis of initial recommendations and sort of the lessons on resiliency from COVID-19 into a few different categories, talking about leadership and coordination, talking about preparedness, talking about prevention and mitigation, talking about response and recovery. I think, it's worth noting that, again, in that section, we highlighted about 30 recommendations from the initial report that are made sort of all the more urgent or sort of validated, to use the term in a non-technical sense, by the COVID-19 pandemic and what we've observed. But I would say that there are two in particular that I'd want to highlight. The first is our recommendation for the creation of a national cyber director. In confronting COVID-19 and other catastrophes, I think it's become increasingly clear that the executive branch be guided by strong leadership, including subject matter experts that are sufficiently empowered to coordinate, to plan, and to prepare for crisis response well ahead of disruptive events. We've seen this played out by the important and very public role that Dr. Anthony Fauci played during the COVID-19 pandemic. Right now in the White House, we don't really have an equivalent for cyber. In the past, we've had the cyber czar. You think about Michael Daniel, you think about Dick Clark before that. We don't really have something like that right now. And the commission feels it's important to ensure institutional survivability of that role. And in order to do so, the commission recommended in our initial report the creation of a national cyber director position in the White House that would be Senate confirmed and supported by a small office. That cyber director would serve a few important roles. They would be the principal advisor for the president on cybersecurity and related emerging technology issues, but they would also serve as sort of a single point of contact in the White House, not only for government agencies and in the National Security Council, but for the private sector in the White House, right? CISA in DHS is going to continue to play an extremely important role in critical infrastructure protection and will be a crucial point of contact for many in the private sector. But there's no real strong point of contact in the White House right now for the private sector. We envision the National Cyber Director taking on that role. The second big recommendation, and this is a massive one, I think, and it'll be clear why for all of you listening, is this notion that we need to have continuity of the economy planning. COVID-19 has obviously disrupted our economy in ways that were largely unanticipated, and the government didn't really have a plan for how we maintain continuity through this massive disruption. We have continuity of operations plans. We have continuity of government plans. Within the U.S. government, operations focuses primarily on the military. Government focuses primarily on the executive branch. But we don't have an equivalent for the economy. Yet the economy is, as I said, I think at the beginning, one of the core sort of pillars of our national power and of what makes America such a strong country. And we need to be able to ensure that it's resilient to shocks, whether they come from COVID-19 or from a cyber attack. In our initial report, we talked about building sort of resiliency and the capacity of the economy to withstand a cyber attack. But I think regardless of the cause of the crisis, we need to have a more robust planning that allows us to understand where the sort of crucial nodes in our economy are that might be attacked or disrupted and would have cascading effects, We need to understand what resources we have to reconstitute, and we need to ensure that we have the resources to reconstitute critical functions. And we need to have the sort of planning and practice and exercises in place that allow us to know who to call, when to call them, whether we are a government stakeholder who is identifying a critical risk in critical infrastructure, or a critical infrastructure provider who's realizing something crazy is going on and the U.S. government needs to know about it. And continuity of the economy planning would go a long way to sort of clarifying a lot of that.
Yeah, that's incredible. And that idea of continuity planning, I mean, I just think about one of the virtual webinars, and we've had so many of them since the pandemic started. But one of the CISOs that we had on, she literally was finished the continuity plan around pandemic response. And it was the same day the CEO said, print that thing and we're putting it into place. I mean, it's impressive that she had it done just in time, but a lot of organizations, weren't prepared. So, and we certainly on a bigger picture want to be, so I can see why you've made that recommendation. That's great. We
need more of that foresight, to be sure. I think, the bottom line is that the United States on cybersecurity, and now we're experiencing something similar, has experienced a number of wake-up calls over the last sort of decade and a half. In 2014, China hacked OPM. We didn't really improve the state of our government cybersecurity. In 2015 and 2016, we saw as Russia turned off the power grid in Ukraine, and we haven't really taken massive steps to improve the security of our power grid. We saw NotPetya and WannaCry in 2017 and 2018. We haven't really done much to lock down our critical systems. And now we're experiencing the pandemic, which is a massive disruption. These have all been opportunities for us to really sort of wake up and smell the roses. And we continually sort of hit the snooze button. And the main contention, and if you take away one thing from the pandemic white paper, is that now is the time to invest. And, we've had plenty of opportunities to sort of say, hey, we need to do this. We should have the foresight to do so. And now I think we're seeing that it's more urgent than ever.
Yeah, I think a lot of our community here at SecureWorld would certainly agree with that. So Rob Morgus, Director of Research and Analysis with the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Thanks so much for being with us today. In the show notes, I am placing links to the Solarium Commission's white paper that Rob authored, and also the Solarium Commission's initial report on cybersecurity that was published in March of 2020. So this is a new commission with a lot of ideas, and they're pushing government and industry to go in the direction of defending our nation in cyberspace and the things we can do to improve that. So thanks again to Rob for being on the show. Thanks to Trend Micro for sponsoring today's podcast, and to our show editor, Pete. Yay! On behalf of the entire SecureWorld team, I'm Bruce Sussman, your host of the SecureWorld Sessions, and let's catch up again on Tuesday.
All vents indicate open. Ready now.
The physical process of diving the submarine is relatively